Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. Today, we do have Ernest Johansson to talk to us about suicide prevention. Ernest, thank you so much for doing those sessions to us.
I'm very glad to be here, and I feel very passionate about.
Sessions.
Yes, I, I I feel very glad to be here, and I'm very passionate about mental health and mental health issues. So, I'm very happy to do these sessions, and I have spoken in front of either virtually or in person in front of a wide variety of organizations in London, and I'm very happy to do this. I believe in addressing mental health and the importance of doing so. So, yeah. Today's topic is suicidality and suicide prevention. And it's often a difficult thing to talk about. And that's one thing, and I've said this, I believe, before, that is I have to remind myself of outside of my professional circles, is that it's not normal to consistently talk about suicide. It's not like, oh, there we go. It's not something that is an easy subject to broach in a lot of audiences in a lot of contexts. And the truth is that we're all impacted by it in one way or another. The numbers in Canada are relatively consistent through the years. The data for suicides is taken per 100,000, and there are roughly 20 males per 100,000 that complete suicide in a given year in Canada. And then in for women, it's a little less significant, but still very significant. Five within 100,000 will commit suicide in a given year. And the reasons for that are uh, they're pretty telling. When I talk about addictions, this will be fleshed out a little bit as well. But men are really taught that the only emotions it's safe to have are emotions of anger. Um, and that lends itself to bottling up a lot of more emotions, having a lot more shame about processing negative feelings. And women, one part of gender inequity and patriarchy is that women are disadvantaged in most ways. However, women are taught that it's okay to express unwanted emotions and difficult emotions, at least more so than men. And that leads to higher rates of suicidality amongst men, but that's not to say it's not a problem for women. Additionally, there are other groups in which suicide is more common, LGBTQ populations, people living with terminal illness, people with distressed ability to have their basic needs met, food, clothing, shelter, individuals dealing with addiction. And also there are wider sociological factors, as mentioned, poverty, inability to have your basic needs met. Also people in war zones, people in abusive situations, et cetera, are also more likely to complete suicide and also attempt suicide. And that brings me to the next point, is that suicide and suicidality are part of the human experience. Our biology and our psychology are designed to survive just about anything. However, it is a common part of our experience to experience suicidality or suicidal thoughts. And long story short about that, the most basic type of suicide is suicidal ideation or passive ideation. Um, and that can be a feeling of just, if I wasn't here anymore, my problems would all go away. If I just went to sleep and never woke up again, all my problems would be gone. And that's an example of passive ideation, which is the most basic form of suicidality. And most people experience that at some point in their lives, although certainly not everyone. And usually that doesn't really lead to wider repercussions in most people because it tends to be a passing thought. And then the risk of suicide kind of goes up when that passing thought becomes a little bit of a plan of action. And there starts to be like, yeah, my problems would be gone if I wasn't here anymore. What if I ended my life? And that in and of itself is kind of, a sign that people need to reach out for help. And then that escalates to the point where people are making concrete plans to end their life. There's discussion of means. And most common means is overdose, but certainly not the only one. There are some means that are kind of outdated insofar as carbon monoxide poisoning with cars. Cars with modern catalytic converters cannot cause carbon monoxide poisoning. You'd have to have a car where the catalytic converter is disabled or a car built before 1970 in order to do that. However, in working in mental health and suicide prevention, you do see that plan and someone's plan quite a bit even today, even though the the mechanism to complete that type of suicide is not at all um, viable anymore. Sorry, my son just walked in the room. Outside playing. Um, sorry, sorry for the disruption. We are live. So basically, once people start talking about a plan and start making concrete mechanisms to follow through with that plan, that's another level of risk for suicide. And then beyond that is concrete plan, time frame, and more of a specific plan for following through with all of that. Um, and oftentimes when people reach this level of suicide, they are almost feeling euphoric, like everything, all my problems, all my issues are going to end. And sometimes people around them will see almost like a happy or a kind of unconcerned, no cares in the world feeling. And other times people will see individuals who are giving everything they own away, kind of saying goodbyes to people or leaving notes or what have you, and that ups the level of risk. Now, not all suicide attempts have that level of planning, and most actual attempts are couched in more a reactive place, like I feel like everything would be better if I wasn't alive because all my problems would go away, and here's an opportunity. And I discussed this before in one of the earlier sessions, is um, a lot of suicide intervention is about stopping that type of reactive thinking. The truth is that if someone wants to fully follow through with ending their life and completing suicide, there isn't too much people can do to stop them if they're fully committed to it. But most attempts are actually a place of reactivity plus opportunity, i.e., I feel like my problems would be better if I ended my life, they'd be gone. And then an opportunity like jumping off a bridge, or there's a bottle of a fatal dose of Benadryl is basically a bottle and a half of Benadryl, or um or pills plus alcohol or what have you. And if you reach someone in that point of reactivity, you're very likely to have a positive resolution where they don't complete suicide. There was a study, and I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, I'm from Oakland, California. There was a study based in San Francisco, and I've mentioned this before, of individuals who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. And they interviewed the survivors. And to a man, every single person, every man and woman who attempted to jump regretted the attempt. And some of that might be due to serious physical injury that came with the attempt, and some of that might be due to um, repercussions of the attempt. But that impulsivity is a passing state. And if given the opportunity to have a buffer, to have a break, individuals are able to choose to live. Now, there are also other types of suicidality. Um, there are certain mental health conditions where um, people are more prone to frequent feelings of suicidality. A lot of these conditions are born of trauma, where the suicidality will be just part of the person's day-to-day existence. And some days are more of a struggle than others, but there's always that thought of, I could end my life. And there's always this thought of, um, I have a plan to end my life. Now, for some people in that condition, they may have a chronic mental health disorder, such as major depressive disorder, or some form of anxiety disorder, be it PTSD or generalized anxiety disorder. And that suicidality is a product of consistently low esteem, self-esteem, consistently poor markers of identity, and consistently, simply put, feeling down. And it might seem like a relief. And people in these populations do tend to complete suicide more frequently. Additionally, there's a lot of mental health disorders, um, cluster B mental health disorders, in which suicidality is what can be described as parasuicidality. It is used as a mechanism, though potentially fatal, and there is certainly intent to end life a lot of the time as well. But it parasuicidality in the sense that the motive for the actions are also or alternatively geared towards meeting a need that the individual perceives is not met. Typical people with cluster B personality disorders, and I must add, these disorders are universally born of trauma, typically early life trauma. So this is not a judgment of the individuals that exhibit these behaviors, but rather an observation about how they got there. But individuals with cluster B personality disorders will often show suicidal behavior to assuage feelings of abandonment, needing to know that people care about them. So the suicidal behavior elicits a response, and then they feel like people care about them. So it can be a professional response, it can be in their personal life, um, it can be a combination of both. And one of the things that happens is individuals with these personality disorders will kind of, I I hate to use the analogy of the boy who cried wolf, but will engage in suicidal behavior or actions or statements, and then um, they'll become kind of a muting of their behavior to those around them, even up to including professionals. And I've certainly seen that happen. And then what they will do is their feelings of abandonment are all the more exacerbated when people don't respond as well. And then they'll kind of up the ante and engage in higher risk behavior that is included in parasuicidal behavior. And sometimes that can be fatal. So it's almost like a quote unquote accidental suicide. People with these types of personality disorders tend to have lots of hot and cold relationships, very binary relationships. Either someone is a sinner or a saint and nothing in between. And that also feeds into feelings of abandonment, which feeds into these feelings of needing to engage in suicidal behaviors in order to get their needs met. Additionally, for people in these populations, suicidal behavior is a mechanism of control and agency. Given that these populations have um, an intimate relationship with trauma and early life trauma, a lot of times there'll be influences on their life that are significantly out of their control, and they've never felt a sense of agency over their own lives. And ending one's life is basically the ultimate agency. So the suicidal, not wanting to let go of the means of suicide, not wanting to let go of the the narratives of suicide is because those narratives and those means represent control in their life in ways that they've never experienced before. Now, that is a relatively small sliver of the population that engages in suicidal behavior, and it is um it can't be overstated that every potential attempt needs to be, or every set of suicidal behaviors or statements needs to be followed up with seriously, because I'd rather over respond to someone who's engaging in parasuicidality, because at the end of the day they're alive if you over respond, than under respond and be wrong. So that's something that's highly important. And also, to be clear, this represents a relative minority in the suicidal population. Now, um, I'm certainly open to questions at this point before I get into more of the prevention piece, but that's a general outline of how suicidal behavior manifests. Substances are a factor. Um, Life events are a factor. In other words, people are more likely to be impulsive when they're using substances that are altering their mental state, and also major life situational stressors. The major ones of are death of a loved one, end of a long-term relationship, a loss of employment. Additionally, moving is actually one of those major stressors, or even getting a new job, a significant change. Any change, significant change can be a major stressor that triggers this type of behavior. Also, world events. There have been certain world events during um, recent times or relatively large-scale local events during recent times that have caused a spike in suicidal behavior. For instance, on our crisis phone lines, we prior to COVID lockdowns, so in February of 2020, we took an average of about 83 to 85 calls a day. And then in late March, early April of that year, those numbers more than doubled. There were some days we were taking over 200 crisis suicide calls on a given day, and the average went up to about 160 per day. And I could pull up the charts right now, but basically we've never gone back down. So there's been more of a demand for those crisis phone lines. And as an aside, our funding has remained the same for those phone lines, but at the same time, the demand is more than doubled. So we've had to get a lot more creative in order to make sure those phone lines are answered appropriately. And we've involved a lot more staff that weren't previously involved in answering those phone lines. So that's a basic outline of suicidal behavior, and it is very basic. But now let's talk about prevention. Now, the the number one piece for prevention is basically if someone is engaging in behavior where they exhibit or statements where they're stating they want to end their life, especially if they have means or a plan, call 911, direct them to us, um, take action, first of all. But there are also more subtle signs as well, especially for more chronic suicidality people, or rather for more deeper kind of episodic suicidality. People become withdrawn, they lose interest in commonly enjoyed behaviors or activities, they lose interest in whatever communities they're involved in. Um, and especially those factors combined with uh, giving away things, not really thinking about the future, abandoning what they what they care about in life, becoming withdrawn from friends and family, and those are all red flags. And while the criteria for eliciting like a wellness check on an individual are a little bit, um, you couldn't elicit a wellness check on someone because or it wouldn't be appropriate to elicit a wellness check on someone because they're withdrawing from a social group. But keeping an eye on the individual, connecting with them, engaging with an individual who is exhibiting these behaviors in an open-ended kind of non-threatening way, like, hey, if you'd like to hang out, I'd love to hang out with you. Do you want to do this? Um, those are all important things that a layperson could do. Now, um, in our field, usually we use a data-based suicide screener in order to assess the level of risk. The most commonly used one, and it's available on the internet, and actually there's trainings on how to use it for free on YouTube. It's called the Columbia Scale, or the Columbia, I forget the acronym, CSSRS, Columbia Suicide Screening. I'm sorry, I forget the acronym. But basically, it is a brief 6-question assessment about the level of risk associated with suicide or someone's suicidal thoughts. And the first question is, as I mentioned before, have you ever wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? And that, frankly, it is, as I said before, it's not uncommon for people to have this thought at some point in their life. If there's a big test coming up, um, and someone's in high school or first year university, and there's a big exam or big test coming up, is it uncommon for students facing this pressure to think, oh man, if I just didn't wake up, this pressure would be all gone? No, it's not uncommon. It doesn't mean that they're at acute suicidal risk, but they've had an ideative thought or a moment of passive ideation. If this individual hasn't had that thought, then no risk there. If yes, the next question is, have you actually had any thoughts of killing yourself? And um, that piece can be high risk, or it can be a mechanism of, yeah, I've given thoughts to jumping off a bridge, but I wouldn't do it. or it can be a little bit more high risk. So if this individual answers yes to this question, um, then based upon a few factors, the next question is asked. Have you ever thought about how you might do this? Jumping off a bridge, let's say. And then have you had these thoughts with an intent on acting upon them? And if the answer to that is yes, have you thoughts, have you started to work out details about how you're going to do this or how you plan to carry it out? Basically, the more concrete planning there is, the higher the risk becomes. And then past behavior, have you ever done anything to end your life in the past? And frequency, have you done something within the last 3 months or 2 months? The data is a little fuzzy on which matters more, but nonetheless, um, have someone engaged in this type of behavior within a recent time frame? If there is yes to several of those questions, the individual is deemed high risk. And at that point, as a professional, what you have to do is make a safety plan to fracture their contact with the means of completing suicide, i.e., if their plan is to overdose, giving the pills to someone else, or if their plan is to jump off a bridge, make plans to restrict their access to bridges, whatever that might be. It may be, giving their car keys to someone or spending the night with someone or what have you. Um, and these in crisis services, these are designed to be temporary short-term plans because, again, as I stated, most actual attempts are impulsive and are in the moment. And then ultimately, if someone is high enough risk and they are not able to safety plan for whatever reason, at that point, you have to recommend the individual be placed on or assessed for what's called a Form 1. Form 1 is a mental health criteria in which someone is put on a 72-hour hold in hospital to evaluate their mental health. The criteria are inability to care for oneself such that they might cause themselves dire harm, a threat to harm others, and a threat to harm themselves. And if people are not willing to go willingly, what you have to do is frankly contact police, unfortunately. And the idea is to involve, use as little, what I'm going to say, authority as possible to get people to work with you in order to develop a safety plan. However, there are times at which that's not possible. Now, that's kind of professional interventions. For a layperson, all you can really do is engage with people in an open-ended way that is validating and non-threatening. Um, Validate feelings. I understand that you're not feeling well right now. I understand that this is hard for you. And encourage them to contact professionals such as us at the crisis center, dialing 988, dialing our crisis line, attending the crisis center, seeing the mobile team, what have you. And ultimately, if you feel the risk has gone up based upon some of those red flags that I've talked about before, calling 911 and asking for a wellness check. Now, most wellness checks don't necessarily result in a Form 1. Usually what happens is police will refer to other professionals. A Form 1 is really in very specific circumstances warranted. However, it's best, in my opinion, at that point to get professionals involved. So with that, I can kind of elaborate in the context of questions, but perhaps we should open up for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Ernest. Please, if you are watching us through any of the social media platforms, feel free to ask your questions uh, in the comments, and they will be asked to the presenter and answered accordingly. Meanwhile, Ernest, if I may ask you, how we can just do some sort of evaluation in order to identify the real or serious suicide attempt rather than or versus the one that just came to attract attention, for example.
Well, I think the most important thing to do there is I would rather over respond, and for someone who's kind of exhibiting behavioral suicidality, I would rather over respond them to under respond and be wrong. So in terms of differentiating that, my opinion is, frankly, that's usually best left to professionals. Um, because as I said, you don't want to be wrong. And I don't imagine being wrong about that would be something that would be very easy for people to live with. And further to that point, a lot of the parasuicidal behavior or suicidality that is designed to meet a different need is still potentially lethal. I have, and I'm going to be very vague about the specifics because I definitely want to adhere to PHIPAA, but I am aware of individuals engaging in parasuicidal behavior where they will actually take pills, not enough to overdose, and long term, this behavior is um, detrimental to one's health. But so they will take pills, but do so to the point where it still requires a medical response, and there'll be a 911 response. The individuals will likely go to hospital. And I've known of individuals who have died by engaging in this behavior, even if clinically you could say it was parasuicidal behavior. The motivation might have been to assuage abandonment. The motivation might have been to, get the attention of others, or might have been to show that they are in control of their life or lack thereof. But that doesn't matter if they die. So I think that's best left for professionals. And these are very specific chronic mental health conditions that are typically born of trauma and are don't affect a significant number of people in the population. And so, A, I don't think lay people should be making that determination. And B, it is relatively unlikely, statistically, this is a smaller percentage of people. So it's relatively unlikely that if you're aware of suicidal patterns in someone or suicidal statements, it's statistically unlikely that it would be one of these parasuicidal episodes. So the answer to that is the short answer is you don't. It would be my response to a layperson. To a clinician, um, you can you're aware of a wider pattern of behavior. You're aware of a history of trauma. Usually, there's a certain diagnoses. Borderline personality disorder is the most common one. Um, there's a few others, and you can work to build safety plans and agreements with the individual, and basically they don't um this pattern will be established, and there'll be someone you likely see a lot as a professional until they engage in certain therapies, typically some form of behavior therapy combined with trauma therapy. And people do recover from this, and people do manage to change the way they engage with their mental health and suicidality, and continue to live, good lives. But so the short
So,
answer is, sorry.
yeah. So if I may summarize that, it's better safe than sorry.
Absolutely. Better safe than sorry. And even for professionals who might not specialize in suicidality, better safe than sorry. Um, I would rather see someone with a cluster B personality disorder as a client 5 times in a week than have someone not call. Um, and there are other kind of behaviors individuals in this population might exhibit, like chronic self-harm behavior. And self-harm is differentiated from suicide in intent insofar as um, and it's kind of like an addictive behavior, and I'll talk about that next week. But self-harm might be cutting, it might be burning, it might be hitting oneself, and it's a behavior that causes physical pain, typically, that which in turn has a dopamine rush or an endorphin rush, and it becomes a mechanism to manage distressful emotions. It might look like suicidality to someone who's not versed in these mental health issues, i.e., someone cutting their arm with a razor blade certainly looks like an attempt to end one's life, but that can also be a way of emotional release. There are also some individuals who would do the same kind of thing with taking a lower dose of a potentially fatal overdose of medication. Actually, I've seen it a lot with Benadryl, as people will take like 4 times the recommended dose of Benadryl and fall asleep. And it's a way they can kind of feel in control and kind of mimic suicidal behavior in a way that is sublethal. But that said, to a layperson, someone cutting their wrist with a razor blade certainly looks like suicidality. And please let the professionals make that determination to keep people safe. Better safe than sorry.
Thank you, Ernest. So, on the other side, from a professional and scientific point of view, what do you think of having the faith raised? Uh, that, well, God or the superior, the spiritual power, whatever you are believing in, will give me the relief, will give me justice. So, uh, keep the hopes up, so that would prevent suicidal from happening. When I'm talking about this, I just came to my mind the Count of Monte Cristo when he was locked in Chateau d'If, and uh, he was super desperate in all the ways until he think about hanging himself, and then he just looked at that rock where the sentence where God will give me justice. And of course, the story, which is a funny one, but from a professional point of view, what would you say to the spiritual beliefs or spiritual powers, if I may call that, believing in God and Allah,
Mhm.
and yeah, that could help us to move on and prevent any suicidal behavior?
So addictive behavior and suicidal behavior um, are both kind of marked with disconnection. And people need to have connection and communities in their life and in order to be as mentally healthy as possible. And sometimes it doesn't matter what that community is. It can be a team, it can be a church or a mosque, it can be coworkers, it certainly can be family. But the more connections an individual have, and certainly you can have multiple ones, um, the generally better the mental health outcome. And the more connected you are to a community, the more likely you are to think of that community and that group in order to maintain your mental well-being. I can't commit suicide because I know this person and this person and this person, and I have positive relationships with all of them. Therefore, this would not, we're all interconnected. And religion can be a good thing for people because it fosters that feeling of interconnection, and that fosters that feeling of, hey, as you put it, Allah is going to provide justice for me, so I'm not going to let this problem overcome me. And that can be a good thing. However, it can also be a challenging thing for people. A lot of the reason why, for instance, LGBTQ populations, in particular teenagers, have higher rates of suicide than the general population is there's sometimes a lack of acceptance of them in certain faith communities at certain times. And it's not universal to any one faith, um, because certainly there are a lot of communities that are accepting as well, but that can also be a factor. So it really depends on one's relationship with that community. If it is a positive thing in someone's life, and for many people it is, then yes, that can be a positive factor. So if one is in part of what I talked about on my mental health all stars piece, if that is a positive thing in your life, then yes, that can be a preventative factor. But it's not always a positive thing for everyone. So the answer to that is as diverse as the world's population is. That said, um, the connection to a faith community is a very powerful thing in a lot of people's lives, and that certainly can be a preventative factor in keeping people alive.
Thank
So
you,
yeah,
Ernest.
no problem.
So we do have a question here on LinkedIn platform. So thanks for offering the conference. My question is, in case a friend or a family member performs self-harm, do we need to act as if they were suicidal?
It depends. It depends on how severe the self-harm is. It depends on, are they stating that, I'm not doing this to injure myself? Do they trust you with this information? I'm just doing this to relieve emotional pain. However, I mean, frankly, there's a lot of self-harm behavior that actually does end up accidentally ending someone's life as well, um, especially when substances are involved. And individuals can end their life by cutting too deep if they're cutting with razor blades, for instance, which is one of the most common types of self-harm. So I would reframe it. Do you have to act if you think it's a suicide attempt, I would reframe it in terms of you should probably act if you think it's potentially harmful in a permanent way, in a significant way, up to including death. So, in other words, I would, as stated before, I'd err on the side of caution. But if someone is cutting and, let's say, drinking alcohol consistently to the point where they don't have as good judgment, then yes, I would involve professionals. If someone says, hey, yeah, I punched myself in the thigh repeatedly because I'm upset, but I'm not trying to hurt myself, honestly, that's going to leave a thigh bruise that will heal. It's probably not going to end your life. Um, so the answer is, based upon your knowledge, how risky is the behavior, and err on the side of caution. So that's the short answer.
So hopefully this answered the question. If there's any more questions or comments or feedback on the answer, please feel free to use the comments. So meanwhile, I'm asking our friends who's watching us on different social media platforms, if you have any question, comment, please use the chat comments to post them, saying once. Saying twice. Well, Ernest, as always, wonderful, fruitful, straight to the point, easy to understand presentation. We are so grateful, sir.
You're very welcome. I'm very passionate about these issues, and I think that um, there needs to be open discussion about suicidality because ultimately it saves lives. And further to that point, it also saves a lot of anguish for loved ones of people who've completed suicide or attempted. Um, and so just having basic tool sets and basic understanding around what suicidality looks like, I think can help any community and all of our communities very much.
By all means, and if we are able to save one single life, then we got it.
Exactly.
So thank you, Ernest, for this, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And we are looking forward to see you at another session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. Stay well, stay safe, and looking forward to the next session. Bye bye.
Awesome.